We live surrounded by light, but something in us keeps dimming. The screen glows, the feed moves, the music plays, and yet inside, a fog. You wake up tired. You scroll, you eat. You reply, you watch. But nothing lands. Nothing holds. And they call it laziness. They call it lack of will. But deep down, you know it's something else.
It's not that you don't want to act. It's that everything feels hollow. And no one teaches you what to do when nothing moves you anymore. Because motivation isn't born from noise. It's born from meaning. And we've replaced that with distraction. You weren't always like this. There was a time when you cared, when you felt fire, even if it was small. But now the world offers you 1,000 ways to escape, and no time to listen to yourself. Every pause gets filled, every silence gets skipped, and suddenly you're surrounded by stimulation, but starving for purpose. Viktor Frankl understood this, not from theory, but from horror. He watched people lose everything, and yet some survived, not because they had strength, but because they had why. Meaning didn't erase the suffering, it gave it a shape, a direction, a reason to stay alive even when staying alive made no sense. And maybe that's what you're missing. Not energy, not goals, but meaning. The world tells you to chase pleasure, chase success, chase what's easy. But your soul doesn't want ease, it wants truth. So what if your apathy is not a failure, but a signal? What if your exhaustion is sacred, a rebellion against a life built on autopilot? This video isn't a motivational speech, it's a mirror. Because if you're still here, something in you hasn't died. Something still wants to rise. And that part of you, tired, quiet, buried under notifications, might be the most important thing you've ever ignored. Maybe that ache you carry isn't a flaw. Maybe it's a whisper, a quiet plea from the part of you that remembers what stillness feels like. Before the noise, before the feed, before the flood of empty content masked as connection. Because your mind wasn't built for this endless flicker of artificial light, this constant flood of dopamine, always just one swipe away. For thousands of years, the human brain lived in rhythm. Sunlight and nightfall, effort and rest, tension and release. But now, it's all tension. No pause, no breath. Just stimulus layered on top of stimulus. And that's not evolution, that's erosion. We were meant to reflect, to wander, to sit in the quiet space where thoughts stretch and meaning finds its way in. But we don't sit anymore. We scroll, we swipe, we numb. Not because we're lazy, but because silence has become unbearable. Ask yourself, how often do you reach for your phone not to connect, but to escape? You open it, not out of curiosity, but to avoid yourself. That's the new ritual, dopamine on demand. But the price? Depth, memory, will, the very fuel of motivation. Your brain, overstimulated and undernourished, forgets how to want the slow things. It forgets how to wait for meaning, how to crave real transformation. Because the fake version is always flashing right in front of you. That's the quiet death no one talks about. Not the dramatic collapse, but the subtle loss of inner life. You stop dreaming. You stop wondering. You stop feeling that fire to move, to build, to become. And as Frankl warned, a man without meaning doesn't just suffer, he dissolves. He becomes reactive, scattered, tired without knowing why. So if you've been feeling this numb fog settling in, Don't judge it. Witness it. It's not weakness, it's a symptom, a signal that you've been flooding your mind and starving your soul. In the next part, we'll go deeper into what happens when this overstimulation becomes chronic, how it drains your vitality, and what you lose when you can no longer hear your own voice beneath the noise. A mind that never rests doesn't think, it reacts. It jumps from spark to spark, never anchoring, never deepening, just consuming what's next, and what's next, and what's next. Thought becomes reflex. Presence becomes impossible. And here's the cost. When your attention is constantly hijacked, your ability to reflect, to actually step back and feel, choose, discern, begins to disappear. You don't lose intelligence, you lose access to yourself. Reflection is more than mental activity. It's the soul breathing. It's the pause between what you feel and what you do. It's the space where meaning starts to form, and without it, you drift. Because when every second is filled with noise, that sacred space where clarity lives is swallowed whole. And in its place, anxiety, mental fatigue, a mind that doesn't want insight, just escape. And that's the shift no one notices. You stop looking for truth. You start craving relief, quick relief, fast dopamine, easy sedation. You scroll not to connect, but to forget. You eat not to nourish, but to silence the ache. You work not to create, but to feel control over the chaos inside you. This is the addiction beneath the addiction. Not to pleasure, but to distraction. And what happens when you go too long without returning to yourself? You forget how you actually feel. You forget what matters. You forget who you are. That's not laziness. That's dissociation. You start following what's trendy, not what's true. You say yes when you mean no. You pursue goals you never questioned and wonder why they don't move you. Søren Kierkegaard once said that the greatest despair is to forget your own self, to live without ever becoming who you truly are. And that's exactly what this world demands, that you move fast enough to never stop and ask, what do I want? No pause, no space, just reaction. But as Viktor Frankl reminded us, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose. And when that space is gone, so is freedom. In the next part, we'll go into the real consequence of this collapse. How what you call demotivation is often your soul refusing to keep chasing what doesn't feed it. In a world obsessed with performance, the absence of motivation is seen as a malfunction. If you're not producing, something must be wrong with you. You must be lazy, flawed, weak. But what if it's not a flaw at all? What if your apathy is not a failure, but a message? Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're responding, the only way your soul knows how, to a life that no longer makes sense. This exhaustion you carry might not be fatigue, it might be resistance, a quiet refusal to keep chasing illusions, to keep pretending that the next goal, the next upgrade, the next applause will finally be enough. Deep down, you know it won't, and your body knows. That's why it stops moving. We call it demotivation, but it's really disconnection from purpose, from truth, from yourself. You've spent years pushing forward, checking boxes, meeting deadlines, performing the role. But when was the last time you felt alive doing it? We weren't built to chase empty victories. We were built to serve meaning. And when meaning is absent, motivation dies, not because you don't care, but because there's nothing real left to care about. You're not lazy, you're starved. A plant cannot grow in fake light and lifeless soil. And yet, this is how most people live, under fluorescent expectations, trying to grow without roots. Of course, your spirit resists. Of course, it shuts down. This is what Viktor Frankl understood better than anyone. After losing his family, surviving the unspeakable in Nazi camps, he didn't cling to pleasure or power or comfort. He clung to meaning. He realized that a soul anchored in purpose can endure anything. But a soul severed from meaning dies slowly, even in freedom. That's where most people are now. Alive but not living, awake but numb. Demotivation is not a disorder, it's a signal. The soul's final attempt to say, "This isn't it." And if you can hear that voice, beneath the shame, beneath the pressure, you are already on the path back. In the next part, we enter Frankl's deepest insight, that purpose is not something we invent, it's something we remember. He watched men die with their eyes still open. He saw people lose their names, their memories, their meaning, long before they lost their lives. Viktor Frankl didn't read about suffering. He walked through it. Auschwitz wasn't a theory, it was his daily reality. And yet, amid that inferno, he noticed something that defied logic. Some people, broken, starved, humiliated, still carried light in their gaze, still stood with dignity, still chose to care. It wasn't strength, it wasn't luck, it was purpose. They had something, or someone, they refused to betray by dying inside. Frankl called this the will to meaning, not the will to pleasure, not the will to power. Meaning, that quiet force inside a human soul that refuses to collapse simply because life has become unbearable. He built his entire philosophy around this, logotherapy, the idea that your primary drive as a human being isn't to feel good or to win or to be admired, it's to matter. And when that sense of meaning disappears, you don't just feel tired, you feel hollow, disoriented, lost in your own life. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most people are already there. We just hide it behind achievement, behind goals that aren't even ours, behind performance masks that make us look alive while something inside us starves. Frankl flipped the modern world on its head. He said you don't need to wait for motivation to act. You need to act towards something that matters. And then the energy comes. It's not about how to move faster, it's about why you move at all. Ask yourself, what would still be worth doing, even if nobody clapped, even if nobody posted it, even if it didn't make you richer, prettier, or more admired? Because that's the only thing that will keep you standing when everything else falls. And no, it doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to change the world. It just has to be real. It has to touch something in you that cannot be commodified or faked. In the next part, we'll go into the one thing modern life is terrified of: stillness. Because in the quiet, meaning starts to whisper again. You say you're tired, but maybe it's not your body. Maybe it's your soul, drenched in noise, buried in tasks, begging for a silence you keep avoiding. Because silence is not empty. Silence is a mirror. And most people are terrified of what it might reflect. That's why we scroll. That's why we chase. That's why we can't sit still for 5 minutes without reaching for something, anything, to numb the discomfort of being alone with ourselves. But here's the truth. Discomfort is not punishment. It's a door. And behind that door is everything you've been searching for. Viktor Frankl understood this like few ever did. He saw meaning not in escape, but in encounter. And the first thing we must encounter, before purpose, before passion, before motivation, is ourselves, raw, undistracted, undressed. But we've been trained to fill every pause, every waiting room, every elevator ride, every space between one breath and the next, until there's no space left. And without space, nothing can grow. Without silence, the soul cannot speak. Because the soul doesn't scream, it whispers. It speaks in sensations, in memories, in subtle nudges that only reveal themselves when everything else gets quiet. That's why silence is sacred. That's why it hurts. It strips away the lies, the roles, the noise you mistook for identity. And what's left feels unfamiliar, maybe even terrifying. But it's you. It's always been you. This stillness, uncomfortable as it may be, is not your enemy. It's your invitation to stop, to feel, to finally face the ache you've tried to cure with caffeine, performance, noise, and dopamine. Frankl once said that life constantly asks us a question, and we must answer. But how can you answer what you never heard? If you never stop moving, never pause long enough to listen, your life will not be a response. It will be a reaction. And reactions rarely lead to meaning. They lead to exhaustion. So here is your task. Turn off the sound, not just the phone, the inner need to escape, and stay. Just stay. Because the longer you remain in that silence, the more the truth begins to emerge. And what you find there might finally make you feel alive again. There comes a moment when the search ends, when you stop trying to ignite yourself with the same noise that burned you out, when you realize the silence you feared was never emptiness. It was truth waiting to be heard. Because real motivation doesn't come with fireworks, it doesn't roar, it whispers, and it only whispers when the world gets quiet enough to listen. The hunger you feel isn't for more goals, more hustle, more dopamine. It's for meaning, for something that can't be scrolled past or bought or chased. Something that only rises when everything else falls away. And that something is you. Not the version of you that performs, not the one that pleases, not the one that's always trying to prove he's okay, but the you that remembers, that feels, that longs for more than survival. You see, Viktor Frankl didn't just teach about meaning, he embodied it. In the middle of horror, he chose to turn inward. He chose to find purpose when there was no reason left to believe in anything. And if he could do that in hell, what excuse do we have in this age of abundance? You don't need more stimulation. You need space. You don't need to chase another system or hack. You need to ask yourself, what am I truly here for? Because the answer to that question is what will finally move you. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Because when something inside you becomes non-negotiable, nothing outside of you can stop it. And no, it won't be loud, it won't be fast, but it will be real. And that's enough. So here's your moment. Write in the comments, I will no longer abandon myself to stay distracted. Let that be your first step back. Back to your breath, back to your body, back to your truth. Like this video. Share it with someone whose soul is also exhausted. And most of all, watch the next one. Because the path ahead won't be easier. It'll be quieter, and in that quiet, everything begins again.